The Rhythm Heaven series has some of my favorite games of all time. Instead of using a single mechanic and charting existing songs to it, they have a wide variety of games in which you need to learn different actions timed to various audio and visual cues, and the songs are written around incorporating the rhythms of those cues. There are a few games that have the same spirit as Rhythm Heaven, but only like 3 that use the exact same formula, and one of them is a Toho fan game from 2012. So it looks like I'm gonna have to make my own. It's not gonna be just a clone of Rhythm Heaven, though. It'll also have the basic mechanics of an RPG. Not any of the cool ones, just walking around and talking to people. Anytime the player has to do anything, it'll be its own rhythm game. So the RPG part will basically just be a fancy game selection menu with a story. What that story is something I'll go over later, but for now, let's talk about the more technical aspects. I decided to build out all the basic mechanics of the game first, both to make sure I could actually pull it off, and so that the different systems could fit together nicely from the start, before changing things gets difficult. This part of the game is already finished, but like any good YouTuber, I'll pretend like I'm making it in real time, and you're helping. So here's a basic character controller, and actually this looks really boring. Let's bring in a character model and some animation. There we go. I know I should be using placeholders this early on in development, but look at how cute it is. It's worth it for the video, even if I have to redo the model later. They'll need to be able to interact with objects, so let's add a sphere collider in front of their face and tell it to check for collisions when you press the spacebar. Then we can just give anything interactable a collider and set them on the same collision layers. Some of these interactions should trigger cutscenes. Let's add a variable to take away control from the player, and make this ball start an animation when you interact with it. At the end of the animation, we can add a function call to end the cutscene. Now this little fella needs a friend, so let's make one for them real quick. For dialogue, we can use Nathan Hode's Dialogue Manager plugin. We'll need to make sure dialogue also prevents the player from moving, but otherwise this is pretty much a drag and drop solution for now. One last thing for the player to interact with is doors. Doors generally require buildings, so here's a hospital. Add a collider to the door, make it change the scene, and we've got a door. For extra flavor, we can make it do a door opening cutscene first. Now there's only one major mechanic left, but it's the biggest one, the actual rhythm games. But before we dive into the implementation, let's go over some terms. We'll call each individual rhythm game a minigame to distinguish it from the overall game it's a part of. The minigames can generally be broken down into a visual, a song, and a series of cues. Cues are like these bouncing balls, or the guy yelling at these seals. They're just the things that tell the player what button to press and when. To represent these cues in code, we really just need 2 things: when the cue happens, and everything else. Now that sounds hand-wavy, but the everything else will be different for each minigame, so we can just make it be a number that references some information we give it when making the minigame itself. I ended up with a lot of code that I don't want to go over sequentially, so here's just a quick rundown of how I set up the minigame system. The minigame takes place in its own scene, which has an audio player that I attached a song controller script to. This script controls the most basic mechanics that all the minigames will have. It plays the song and keeps track of where it is in the song, and more importantly, when it needs to play the certain cues. The cues themselves are taken from a JSON file that has all the information specific to the individual minigames. The song controller reads this in to know what it needs to do, so I won't need to modify the script itself for every single minigame. For the parts where I do need to write new code, however, I have a separate game controller script unique to each minigame. It controls all of the visuals and makes the cues happen whenever the song controller tells it to. Whenever the song controller detects an input, it checks it against the closest cue and converts the difference in time to a score. Then it marks it as hit, so the same cue doesn't get counted twice. At the end of the song, the score is compared against some arbitrary thresholds to see if the player did good, okay, or bad. That pretty much covers the main part of the minigames, so the only thing that's left is tutorials, or practice. Since each minigame has its own mechanics, the player needs to be able to learn those mechanics. So we can essentially set up a game before the game that includes some instructional cutscenes and repeats until the player gets a high enough score. And that's it. That's the whole minigame. It works. You may have noticed that the minigame is a lot less pretty than the RPG parts right now. That's because I've put off doing any finalized minigame-specific work until what I'm working on next, which is to try and make a complete minigame all in one go. For the full game to have the scope I'm hoping for, I'll need to be able to finish this minigame in under 2 weeks. So in the next video, I'll be deconstructing Rhythm Heaven's games to try to give myself an advantage. Subscribe to see that. The gap between videos will be way shorter this time, I hope.